Down in southwest Scotland, out in the moors, you can sometimes find graves in very strange places. They're not in churchyards. They're out in open fields, standing alone. These single weathered headstones kind of standing out almost like a Gothic story. But if you go up and read them, often you can find that the dates cluster to around a single decade in the 1680s. And the word that's often used in these tombstones is the same: martyr. Most people buried in these graves were simple folk. Shepherds, weavers, one was a teenage girl, shot or hanged near their homes by their own government over the space of about 35 years. And no, it wasn't Catholic versus Protestant or Protestant versus Anabaptist. This is Protestant Scotland doing it to Protestant Scots. In this case, no one disagreed on salvation. What they disagreed on instead was the church. And the Scots remember this stretch of history by a very specific name. It's called the Killing Time. So let me tell you that story. All right, if you want to know why people die, you have to understand what they're fighting for. The background, the context of this is February 28th, 1638. And we're at a church in Edinburgh called Greyfriars. And something very important begins on this day called the National Covenant. Nobles signing it first, then the ministers. And then copies of this National Covenant were carried throughout Scotland to every corner of the country. At least that was the idea. Essentially what's happening here is Scotland is swearing a national covenant or a national oath. And the oath comes down to one line. And that one line will come to define a group that we call the Covenanters, who are the people that are about to be persecuted. What was the line? That Jesus Christ and no earthly king is the head of the church. Only Christ. Now that is a direct shot, of course, over the border at the English establishment of the royal supremacy, where the king and sometimes the queen is the head or the governor of the church. This is a very strongly worded statement against that. It's also a more cultural position, if you want to call it that, or a pattern of belief about how the church needs to interact with society itself. Because it's not just against the monarchy over in England, it's also saying that if Jesus, and Jesus alone, is the head of the church, then the magistrates and those in charge politically have no right in calling, licensing, getting involved with, or changing doctrine when it comes to the body of the church. And there was an older line that said that when the king enters the church, his power ceases at the doorway. I'm paraphrasing that, but that's essentially the idea here, is that when you enter the church and you sit down, the king ceases to be king, he becomes a man. Now, let me explain a technical phrase here as well, because it adds some nuance. At this time, this concept was often referred to as the crown rights of the Redeemer, sometimes just referred to as the crown rights. Now, that can get a little confusing because you hear crown rights, you think royal, you think political. No, in this case, crown rights of the Redeemer. This is just a slogan or a rally cry, really, for saying that Jesus and Jesus alone is king of the church. But the application of the idea is very simple. A king may govern the state, but he may not govern the conscience. And he is not head of the church because that seat is already taken. Jesus has it. Now, that doctrine was not controversial in the time that they wrote it. Why? Well, England was in the midst of its civil war. They had already cut the king's head off, and they were in the interregnum period, we now call it. And so Scotland is simply saying, along with England, we no longer believe that the king is head of the church. The problem is that in 1660, the monarchy comes back. Charles II, the son of the king who lost his head, returned to England, and he did not enjoy his time away, just put it mildly. And the Restoration Settlement, as it's called, started, of course, in England. And we're used to talking about that. Puritans and others resisting the king's imposition of the Anglican order. This happens in Scotland as well, and that's what we're looking at now. Well, he imposes the same in Scotland. Ministers were now required to accept the arrangement. And roughly a third of the clergy refused and were simply pushed out of their parishes. Now, the one thing that happens in parts of Scotland that does not happen in England is that when the ministers walked out, the parish, the people, walked out with them. And they started having church out in the open, in barns, on the hillside, out on the moors. And these open-air services eventually had a name. They were conventicles. Not the nicest sounding name, but whatever. But to the state, to the government, Charles II's government, this doesn't look like a group of faithful people gathering out in the fields. By the way, one quick side note, Wesley and Whitefield and the Methodists are often heavily credited or the only ones credited with outdoor preaching in the New World, the kind of preaching that led to the first and eventually the second Great Awakening. That's not true. The Covenanters were outdoor preaching before Wesley was even born. When the Scotch-Irish moved to the New World and they go, over the Cumberland Gap and start settling out in the West, they do outdoor preaching all the time. But back to Scotland. The king, seeing these conventicles, began to enact legislation. If you attended a conventicle, you and your family could be fined into financial ruin. If you're the preacher at one, or if you attend one of the larger armed ones, more on that in a second, it can be a capital crime. And dragoons, as they're called, troops were quartered all throughout the Southwest to stamp this out. And so for one generation, this tiny corner of Scotland actually lives under military occupation. So much so that, as I just mentioned, some of the conventicles become armed resistance meetings, sort of surrounded by armed soldiers while everyone inside is hearing some fiery preaching. But the goal, from the top, from Charles II's government, was to break the Covenanters with everything that they had. Now, I won't go into all the details. Essentially, it's a lot of back and forth. Resistance would rise up, then it would get crushed, and then it would rise up and get crushed. But I can give you the beginning, and then I'll give you some of the kind of highlights. It began in May 1679. This is the forerunning to it. And the most hated churchman in Scotland was riding across a stretch of land called the Magus Muir. And his name is James Sharp. And he's Archbishop of St. Andrews. And the reason he is hated is because he had been one of them. Sharp, I mean. He had been a Presbyterian. And then when the Restoration came and Charles II took the throne, he backtracked and went over to the sides of the bishops and actually becomes the regime's chief enforcer. So he's doing this against his former friends. So a party of Covenanters is out on the moor looking for any lesser official that they can kill. And they saw the archbishop's coach instead. And they felt that God had smiled upon them with his providence, and they pulled him down and killed him on the road in front of his daughter. That one murder lit the fuse. That happens a lot in history. But weeks later, there was an armed conventicle, one of those that I was talking about, and a party of dragoons was sent to break it up. But the conventicle at Drumclog won. In fact, it won a decisive victory, so much so that others began to gain momentum from this, and they rose up. The others, though, were not as successful, and they were put down. So all in all, several weeks of some hope, but it was ultimately a crushing defeat for the Covenanters. One of the more famous scenes is that at the end, hundreds of these men were marched to Edinburgh, and they didn't have enough space for them, so they just pinned them up, like in an outdoor churchyard, for months. And it's worth pointing out that churchyard, that kirkyard, was Greyfriars. It's the same ground where 41 years before the National Covenant had been signed. And now here Covenanters were being pinned in and ready to be executed for their faith. And there's lots of other stories like that. All that is prologue. The killing time, as it was called, belongs to 2 years in particular, 1684 and 1685. It's called the killing time because during those 2 years, the persecution essentially stops bothering with even using courtrooms. And the system was pretty simple. The government drew up an oath that a person was to swear to abjure, that means renounce, the radical Covenanters and their declarations. That's the oath. And soldiers are now authorized to put the oath to people they meet anywhere, out in the fields, on the spot, and if they refuse it, you could be shot where you stood. No judge, no appeal, nothing. One story, for example, was a man by the name of John Brown. He was a carrier and a farmer in Priest Hill. And in May of 1685, he was out cutting peat one day when a party of dragoons found him. And they were led by a man named John Graham of Claverhouse. And Claverhouse puts the question to Brown. He refuses it, takes him back to the house in front of his family. And his family at this point is his wife, pregnant, and his eldest child still hugging mom's knee. And standing there at his house, Claverhouse asked him to swear the oath. When he refused, he was shot in front of his family. Now, that story is an interesting one in Scottish history. You may not be aware of this, but it actually has a longer shelf life. Later in history, and particularly in the 19th century, when national fervor and nationalistic pride is on the rise, Claverhouse actually becomes a little bit of a hero. Walter Scott actually writes a poem about him, in which he's called Bonnie Dundee. But importantly, to the Covenanters, he is Bloody Clavers for the rest of history because of this story. The second story, Margaret Wilson was 18. She was a farmer's daughter, and she was condemned same time, spring 1685, along with an elderly widow for refusing the oath. And they were tied to a stake and driven into the sand at Solway Firth, but in a way that their heads were below the high water mark, and they were left there until the tide came in. Now, not everyone was killed outright, and that's important to know. A great many of those who were sentenced back when they were still using courts were sentenced instead to something called transportation. And transportation is when you would be banished in slavery and sent over to the New World, to the Atlantic or to Jamaica, and sold into bonded labor on the colonial plantations. And as I'll say in a minute, the numbers of those enslaved is the highest number. Not everyone made it over, of course. The seas take a lot of people. So one famous story in 1679, 157 prisoners were locked below deck in a ship called the Crown of London, which was bound for the plantations. And the ship gets up off Orkney, and a storm drove it onto the rocks. Not too bad. The crew gets out themselves, and they get onto shore. The prisoners did not. The hatches were battened down and stayed locked because the captain had already paid for them, and he wanted to make sure that none of them got away if they got to shore. Every single one of them drowned. Now, the numbers top to bottom are hard to square. The problem is that historians across the centuries have tried to count and estimate these numbers. It can be varied. The highest numbers you're going to find are from the Victorian era. They tend to always inflate numbers a little bit. And they get the number of 18,000 martyrs. Modern historians often bring the numbers lower, not because they're cynics, but just, again, because they have more evidence and they do a little more sifting through the data. Well, we can say for certain, at least, and there were probably more, but for certain, roughly about 100 folks were shot dead during that time when the oath was being put to people. About 100. Another 100, maybe 200, would have fallen victim to the scaffold. 1,700 were shipped overseas as slave servants. That larger number, though, shouldn't be just sort of ignored, because not everybody was killed, slaughtered, taken overseas. Plenty of folks were cajoled, oppressed, beaten up, suppressed, and everything else along the way. This really was a time for several years, and actually several decades, that was a reign of terror in southwest Scotland. In fact, the killing eventually ran out of Covenanters. The last of the field preachers was a man named James Renwick. He's the son of a weaver, and he was still in his 20s when he was caught in Edinburgh and hanged out in the grass market. Now, how did all this come to an end? Well, it didn't come to an end with defeat in the traditional sense. It came to an end because of the Glorious Revolution down in England, 1688. And the Stuart dynasty was finally sent off packing, and William and Mary come to the throne, themselves Protestant. And so, in 1690, the Scottish Parliament ratified the very confession that first hundreds and then thousands of Scottish Presbyterians gave their life to defend. What was the core of that idea? That Jesus and Jesus alone is head of the church.